Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jackie Gussner, and I'm a leader in the Federal Reserve's Industry Relations Program. I'll be facilitating today's webinar in conjunction with our presenter, Mark Manyszak of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. On October 3rd, the Federal Reserve Board published a Federal Register notice requesting public comment on potential actions the Fed could take to facilitate real-time interbank settlement of faster payments. The actions outlined in the Federal Register notice are intended to advance public policy goals for faster payments and to help support the modernization of the financial services sector's provision of payment services. As part of its overall mission, the Federal Reserve has a fundamental interest in ensuring there is a safe and robust settlement infrastructure on which the private sector can provide innovative payment services that serve the broad public interest. Today, you will receive an in-depth presentation on the content of the Federal Register notice, as well as the opportunity to ask questions at various intervals throughout the presentation. The hope is you'll come away with a solid understanding of the potential actions the Fed has proposed, and that you'll be encouraged to provide formal written comments to the board. As a reminder, formal comments are due December 14th. Again, thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Mark.
Hey, Mark, it's Jean. You may need to unmute.
Thanks, Jean. Good afternoon. As Jackie said, my name is Mark Manyszak, and I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. As the second slide in the presentation indicates, over the last month or so, we've been holding a variety of town halls that have looked to address or present the material in the Federal Register notice and to answer different questions. And this webinar is one more effort to engage in that sort of outreach with the industry and the public. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk about the Federal Register notice and the potential actions that it presents that the Federal Reserve could take to support the development of faster payments in the United States. So starting on the third slide of the presentation, I want to start with a roadmap for what I'll look to cover today. So first, I'm going to start by discussing faster payments and the role of the Federal Reserve. So what are faster payments? How has the Federal Reserve been involved in efforts to develop these sorts of payment capabilities in the United States? And broadly, how do these fit into the payment landscape as we're thinking about it? Because the role of the Federal Reserve in payments crucially focuses on settlement of payment obligations between banks, and because the Federal Register notice really focuses on potential actions related to settlement, I'm then going to talk about some concepts related to settlement and how settlement fits into a payment. And I'm specifically going to focus on real-time gross settlement as a model for interbank settlement of faster payments. I'm then going to turn to the potential actions presented in the Federal Register notice, specifically the possible provision of a 24/7 by 365 real-time gross settlement service to support interbank settlement of faster payments. And second, the potential provision of a liquidity management tool to help address some of the liquidity management issues that can arise when dealing with 24/7 by 365 real-time settlement. And one thing I should stress is that the Federal Register notice presents these as potential actions that the Federal Reserve could take. And the Federal Reserve could take one of them, it could take both of them, or it could do something else depending on the feedback that's received on the Federal Register notice. And a key purpose of the Federal Register notice is to receive input from the industry and the public about these two potential actions. So to that end, the notice presents a number of questions that the Federal Reserve is seeking input about, and I'm going to conclude my presentation by going through some examples of key questions from the Federal Register notice. And receiving input on these questions is very important, and I would echo Jackie by encouraging people to submit formal comments on the questions that are raised in the notice. Hopefully, by the end of my presentation, people will have a good idea about what faster payments are, so what the payment capabilities are that the Federal Reserve is looking to support, how the potential actions presented in the Federal Register notice fit into the provision of faster payments to end-user customers and what those actions are, and then the types of questions and issues that the Federal Reserve is seeking input about. And in case people have questions about the things that I'm talking about during my presentation, I'm going to periodically pause to see if we've received any questions, and we'll look to answer those questions as I go through my remarks. So turning to the fourth slide in the presentation, I want to begin, as I said, by talking about what faster payments are, where efforts to develop them are coming from, and what involvement the Federal Reserve has had in those efforts. So turning to the next slide, when you think about the last 5, 10, 20 years or so, it's apparent that technology has really altered the way that individuals and households and businesses perform a wide variety of activities. So today, people broadly have access to really advanced communication and communications technologies. And just so, for example, I suspect that everybody listening to this webinar, if they're not sitting in front of a pretty advanced computer, they at least have a smartphone that serves as a portable, convenient, and powerful tool to do all sorts of things. Using these technologies, people can communicate with one another, they can search for and acquire information, and they can do a wide variety of other sorts of tasks, and they can do these things almost immediately, so in effectively real time, and they can do them at any time, so they can do them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, so that for lots of these different types of activities, people really live in a 24/7 real-time world. And these sorts of capabilities haven't only changed what people are able to do, but they've also changed the expectations that people have about speed and availability for a wide range of different types of activities. But at the same time, there's a sense in which the payment experience that businesses, individuals, and households have doesn't really line up with the 24/7 real-time experience that they have for other activities. And it doesn't really line up, this payment experience doesn't really line up with their expectations that they have for a 24/7 real-time world. And instead, in a lot of cases, there's often a gap between the availability and the speed of payment services for end users and the 24/7 availability and real-time speed that technology allows them to do different types of other activities. So faster payments, in broad terms, look to address this gap. That is, they look to provide 24/7 real-time payment services to end users that align with the 24/7 real-time nature of other things that they're doing in their lives. So with faster payments, an individual would be able to send a payment at any time. They'd be able to send it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, at night, over the weekend, on a holiday. And the recipient would receive those funds immediately. That is, that payment would be completed in real time from the end user's perspective. So, for example, if I wanted to pay a friend of mine, I could enter my friend's information into my cell phone, I would press send, and my friend would receive those funds right away. And those funds would be final funds. They'd be final in the sense that my friend would have them and then could turn around and use the funds for other purposes. And we could experience this outcome. I could make the payment and my friend could receive those funds and use them for other purposes at any time of the day or night. So I could do it in the middle of the night if I wanted to, or I could do it on a Sunday afternoon. And that real-time experience could be realized 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So what faster payments ultimately involve is providing end users, so individuals, businesses, households, other users of payment services, with the ability to conduct and complete payments from the end user's perspective in real time and at any time, so that their payment experience lines up with the 24/7 real-time experience that they have with other activities. So over the last 5 years, the Federal Reserve and the payment industry have been involved in an effort to identify potential improvements to the payment system and really more specifically to identify ways to develop faster payment capabilities such that those capabilities can be broadly accessible to the public with benefits that can then be broadly shared by the public. So turning to the sixth slide of the presentation, some people might say, don't we already have services that really allow us to conduct these sorts of faster payments? Don't I have apps on my phone that allow me to transfer money to my friends? And doesn't all this really happen quickly? So in some sense, don't we already have services that allow us to conduct these sorts of payments? And to some extent, that's true. So there are innovative services that have begun to emerge, and these innovative services look to provide enhanced speed and convenience and accessibility that I was speaking about when thinking about faster payments. And these services themselves reflect valuable efforts to enhance the payment experience of end users. But at the same time, these services often have limitations. They may appear to be fast and they may appear to be broadly usable, but they may have limitations with respect to their speed and their reach. So in particular, while it may appear fast in the sense that I seem to be able to complete a payment to a friend quickly through one of these apps, my friend might not actually receive those funds quickly. And if my friend wants to move those funds from whatever service we're using to a deposit account, and deposit accounts are where the public keeps the vast majority of value, both to store that value and then for payment purposes, there can be delays in that movement of money from a service that we might be using to a broadly usable deposit account. So there may be this apparent speed associated with these types of services, but the actual experience in terms of having the funds and being able to use them broadly for other purposes may not actually line up with the apparent speed that we seem to experience. In addition, I typically can only pay my friend if both of us have signed up for the same service. So if I've signed up for the service and my friend has, then we might be able to exchange that payment. But if my friend hasn't signed up for the service, then I might not be able to send that payment to him or her until she or he has signed up for the service. And as a result, there can be limitations to the reach of these types of services, in the sense that I might not be able to make a payment to any possible recipient that I might look to send funds to. Finally, many of these services are often retrofitted on top of older infrastructure that really wasn't designed for use in a 24/7 real-time world. And this sort of use of older infrastructure, sort of retrofitting or jerry-rigging things on top of that older infrastructure, can both introduce delays into a payment, but it can also introduce risks, especially if certain steps in a payment, such as the settlement of interbank obligations related to the payment, happen after the provision of funds to the recipient. And I'll talk about this issue more, particularly the issue associated with deferred settlement, later in my presentation when I talk about what goes into a payment. But as a result of these various issues with existing infrastructure and services are starting to emerge, and the potential implications that the limitations of existing infrastructure might have for the services to end users, a key issue that comes up is the need to develop modernized infrastructure that can not only support faster payments for end users, so it can support the sort of 24/7 real-time payments to line up with other aspects of what people experience in their daily lives, but it can provide those services in a way that is safe, efficient, and broadly accessible to the public. So turning to the next slide of the presentation, efforts to achieve these sorts of improvements in the payment system, so thinking about efforts to improve the speed and convenience of payments for end users, but also to improve the safety and efficiency of payments, these efforts have been the focus of an initiative involving the Federal Reserve and the industry over the last 5 years or so. And this initiative is broadly known as the Strategies for Improving the U.S. Payment System, or the SIPS initiative. As part of this initiative, there was an industry task force that was stood up, and that was known as the Faster Payments Task Force. And that task force looked to identify certain desirable characteristics of an improved payment system in terms of its speed, its safety, and its efficiency, and other aspects of potential improvements. So in addition to identifying these desirable improvements, one of the things that the task force did was to identify various changes that it felt might be necessary to support those improvements, specifically changes to underlying infrastructure. And one of the changes that the task force identified involved a request to the Federal Reserve, asking the Federal Reserve to upgrade its services to allow for 24/7/365 settlement of payment obligations between banks reflecting the 24/7, 365 payments that it looks to support in terms of the improved payment services to end users. This request to the Federal Reserve, in turn, reflects the foundational role that the Federal Reserve, as the central bank, plays in the settlement of payments between depository institutions. So banks hold balances in accounts at the Federal Reserve banks, and the Federal Reserve can adjust those balances. It can debit the accounts of sending banks and credit the accounts of receiving banks to conduct settlement of obligations that arise between banks as a result of payment activity of their customers. And this ability to conduct settlement at the Federal Reserve allows banks to not only conduct settlement with a wide range of possible counterparties, and this is because of the breadth of depository institutions that hold balances with the Federal Reserve, but it also allows settlement to occur without risk related to the settlement institution itself, the institution that's being used to conduct settlement, because the Federal Reserve, as the central bank, will not fail. So the industry's request to the Federal Reserve to consider enhancing its own settlement services reflects the key role that the Federal Reserve plays in the settlement of payments, and the Federal Register notice is then the Fed's response to this request. So the way that this is all played out is basically as follows. The Federal Reserve went to the industry and said, the payments industry doesn't seem to be keeping up with advances in other activities that technology appears to have enabled. Why don't you, payment industry, go out and look at possible improvements that might be made? The industry, through the SIPS initiative, the Faster Payments Task Force, and other activities, then said, okay, there are certain improvements that could be valuable in terms of speed, availability, convenience, safety, and so on. And here's what we think a desirable future state of the industry might look like. But the industry then turned back to the Fed and said, okay, you, Fed, are asking us to identify and make improvements to our own capabilities, but we also think that you, Federal Reserve, also need to make some improvements to your own capabilities, reflecting the key role that you play in the payment system, specifically the key role related to settlement. So the Federal Register notice then reflects potential actions that the Federal Reserve could take to upgrade and modernize its infrastructure as a way of supporting the provision of upgraded and modernized services to end users provided by the industry. So because the potential actions that are the focus of the Federal Register notice really look at the Federal Reserve's role in settlement, I'm going to need to talk some about what settlement means and how it fits into a payment. And that's going to be the next part of my presentation. But before proceeding, I wanted to stop to see if we've received any questions about what this effort to improve the payment system involves, where it's coming from, and what it's looking to accomplish in terms of supporting 24/7 real-time payments for end users, and how the Federal Reserve has been involved in those efforts.
Yes, and this is Jackie again. Mark, we do have several questions here. First of all, will these payments still settle at traditional depository financial institutions?
So I think the answer to that, given what the Federal Reserve is looking to do, would be yes. Some of the other services that I was talking about previously might have taken place outside of the traditional banking industry, but the Federal Reserve providing banking services to banks, particularly services related to settlement, that would involve services provided through traditional depository institutions.
All right, and another question here. In a faster payments environment, you talked about immediate funds usage by end users. Will there be a confirmation for the sender/payer that notify them that funds were sent to the final account that might hold as proof the payment occurred?
So I would again say, this will come up a little bit in my next comments about sort of the conduct of a payment and what goes into a payment. I think that, yes, there presumably would be communication between the banks and their end-user customers, both allowing the sender to send the payment through at any time and in real time, but also to notify the recipient that funds have been received in real time and at any time. And that would be proof, in a sense, that the funds have been received. But I think it's also important the funds would actually then, what's envisioned here is final funds for the recipient, so those would actually be funds that recipient could then turn around and use.
Okay. Another question. Can a check payment I received from someone be converted into a faster payment?
So I don't think at this point that that's in what's being envisioned here. I think it would be an interesting possibility to hear about. I think what is being envisioned here are credit transfers, ultimately, where the sender is initiating the payment to be sent to the receiver, and this is then taking place through a faster payment system or a faster payment service. And I don't think that there could be various legal or other policy issues associated with conversion of payments in that sort of framework. So I think at this point, I would say the answer to that currently would be no.
Okay. Another question. Are the infrastructure issues described in the person-to-person example also experienced by users in person-to-business or business-to-business cases?
So I think there the answer is broadly yes. The sort of infrastructure in terms of the immediate completion of the payment for end users is somewhat independent of who those end users are. I gave the example of person-to-person because it allows one to sort of reference a technology for access, a cell phone. I'm punching numbers in on my phone, and then I'm trying to send that off to my friend. But I think similar sorts of problems could arise or issues could arise in other use cases, which could be business-to-business use cases or person-to-business. Now, the exact details of where the pain points might arise could be slightly different, but there could be similar sorts of issues about when payments can be initiated, how quickly they can be initiated and then received. Those could arise across a variety of different use cases.
Okay, another question here. Will there be enhanced fraud prevention measures?
So I think that fraud prevention, clearly when one moves to a 24/7 real-time world, fraud prevention is going to be an important consideration. At this stage, the details, so as I'll speak about later in my presentation, there are a lot of details associated with the service that are still to be determined if the Federal Reserve were to go forward with the service. I think fraud prevention and fraud mitigation is clearly an important issue, and so determining how best to do that is something that really would require substantial discussion, particularly because for these sorts of payments, if one were thinking about, again, credit push type of payments, the bank that's originating the payments may have the most information and the most sort of control over their customers' access, but there still can be at more sort of a network level important fraud mitigation measures that would need to be implemented. And I think it's important to determine who would be the best party to implement those sort of measures and who would have the information necessary to do so. But I think as the question reflects, accounting for sort of the possibility of fraud in these sorts of payments is extremely important, which is one of the reasons why, in a broader effort, the Federal Reserve has also been engaged with the industry in attempts to improve the security of payments.
And then two more questions here. Can you talk to the bar that the Fed imposes against competing with the private sector and how this affects what you may or may not implement?
So the Fed has a variety of policy criteria that it applies when determining whether or not to introduce a new service, and these are things like the clear public benefit of that service, something that the private sector would be unable to provide with reasonable scope, efficiency, and equity on its own, and the ability of the Federal Reserve to fully recover costs, including an adjustment for what a private sector firm would have to the costs it would face in terms of providing a return to its shareholders. So there are well-established criteria, cost recovery, clear public benefits, and something that would be difficult for the private sector to do on its own that would be taken into account when deciding whether or not to actually move forward with the provision of these services.
Okay, and we'll take one more question here, and then we'll move on. Must each end-user participant have the same service? And how would having different core providers play a part in this process?
So I think that the question is a couple of different things. Must each end-user participant, by end-user participant, I assume what we mean is the individual or the business who's related to the payment, do they have to participate in the same service? I think that depends on how the services are ultimately deployed by the industry. So if one thought about checks, for example, or ACH, there's a sense in which there isn't really a service in the same way that there might be with different sorts of things that may be more specific that you have to sign up for. And so in one particular or one potential world, the faster payments could be more like a sort of a check payment that's universally accessible and can be universally sent regardless of when or where two parties might happen to hold their deposits. Alternatively, there could be value associated with branding and networks and establishing special value-added services that may still benefit from having sort of services that individuals specifically sign up with. I think that really depends on how the industry looks to deploy these. What the Federal Register notice ultimately is going to present is, or ultimately presents, is sort of a foundational infrastructure that could be used in a variety of different ways. Now, the second part of the question, which I think has disappeared, but I think that what it was asking about was, do the parties need to have the same core processors? I think that, again, it's not clear to me that they would need to, because different processors may be able to link into a service on behalf of the banks that happen to use those processors. But I think ensuring that some sort of compatibility is an important element of the design of this sort of service. So, Jackie, I think, should I, yeah, go ahead.
I think that we'll continue to move on. And, folks, just so you know, we'll have 3 to 4 additional opportunities for you to ask questions in this presentation. So if you all could now just turn to slide 8, and we'll continue.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for all the questions. Really interesting to see what people are thinking about and what questions that are on people's minds. So turning to slide 8 of the presentation, I'm now going to spend some time talking about interbank settlement and how it fits into a payment. And what this discussion is intended to do is to give a sense for where the potential actions in the Federal Register notice then fit in. So moving to slide 9 of the presentation, this diagram is intended to provide a simplified illustration of what goes into a payment. So it's simplified in the sense that it leaves out a lot of complexity that can arise, but it also identifies some of the key parties that are involved in a payment and some of the key activities involving those parties. So first, if we start at the top of the diagram, at the top of the diagram are end users. So these would be the individuals, the households, the businesses, whoever it is who wants to send or receive a payment. And these individuals are going to have banks, or more broadly, they're going to have other types of service providers. And these banks or service providers are going to hold funds on their behalf and then allow them to make payments. The parties are going to interact with their banks through what we could think of as an end user service. So this end user service could be an app, it could be a website portal, it could be whatever end users use to communicate with their banks about the need to conduct a payment and the details of the payment. And the potential actions that I'm going to talk about today don't directly concern these end user services. Instead, the actions are intended to support the provision of these services by the industry. But it's important to keep this level of a payment in mind, first of all, because the provision of 24/7 real-time payments to end users is ultimately the objective of efforts to support faster payments. And second, because this is an area where, as some of the questions that have already been raised suggest, the industry would need to build on top of underlying infrastructure. So when thinking about a payment, an end user is going to communicate with its bank about a payment through something like, say, the cell phone app. And it's going to provide information about the payment, like the recipient, the amount, and perhaps the purpose of the payment. And at that point, the banks that are involved in the payment, so the sender's bank and the receiver's bank, they're going to need to communicate with one another to exchange information about the payment. So we can think about this communication of payment information, the exchange of information between banks, as involving what's known as clearing in the sort of second box here in the diagram. So the banks are going to exchange information about the identities of the parties in the payment so that the sender's bank can then debit its customer's account and the receiver's bank can credit its customer's account. And there could be a variety of other activities that would take place as this communication is taking place. So, for example, there could be fraud screens associated with the payments, and there could be storing and potentially netting of payments. And a variety of different types of entities could be involved in this communication. So there could be processors, networks, clearinghouses, but all of that involves the banks communicating the information about payments with one another. So these end-user payments generate obligations between the banks. So the sender's bank owes funds to the receiver's bank that the receiver's bank will then ultimately credit to its customer's account. And the process of discharging this obligation between the banks, of exchanging funds between the banks, reflecting the payment between their customers, this is what is known as settlement. And settlement is going to involve an asset, so something known as a settlement asset, that can be transferred between the banks, and an institution known as a settlement institution that's going to maintain records of the settlement asset and that can conduct settlement by adjusting the holdings of the settlement asset on its books. So payments between customers generate obligations between banks. There needs to be an asset that can be exchanged between those banks and an institution that can affect that exchange or that transfer in order to settle the payment that arises, or the obligation that arises between the banks as a result of their end-user customer activity. So a variety of assets and institutions can be used to conduct settlement, but when the Federal Reserve is involved in settlement, then balances of banks that they hold in accounts at the Federal Reserve banks serve as the settlement asset, and the Federal Reserve is in fact the settlement institution in the sense that it performs settlement by adjusting the balances in those accounts to debit the account of the sender's bank at the Federal Reserve and to credit the account of the receiver's bank. So these adjustments of banks of the balances of banks at the Federal Reserve banks serve to perform interbank settlement by discharging the obligations that result from the underlying payment activity of a bank's customers. So in general terms, these three elements, an end-user service, the clearing or communication between the banks, and the interbank settlement or adjustments to the balances of the banks at a settlement institution are the key parts of the conduct of any payment. So with these three elements in mind, let's think a little bit about what would be necessary to provide end-user customers with a faster payment. And remember that a faster payment is a payment that is real-time from the end-user's perspective and can be conducted 24/7 or at any time. And so when thinking about these sorts of payments, there are some specific things that clearly would be needed. First, the end users are going to need to be able to communicate quickly with their banks at any time. So the sender needs to have a service that allows the sender to immediately communicate information about the payment with the sender's bank, and that service has to be available 24 hours a day. And as was suggested by one of the earlier questions, the recipient needs to be able to at least be able to immediately receive information. Perhaps the payment's at the middle of the night, so receiving that information immediately then is not that important for the recipient, but they need to have the capability to immediately receive the information from the recipient's bank so that the recipient knows that the funds have been received and are available for use. So 24/7 real-time communication between end users and banks is one necessary element of a faster payment. In addition to that necessary element of a faster payment, communication between banks also needs to occur in real time and to be possible at any time. So the banks need to be able to immediately communicate payment information and to be able to do that at night or on the weekend so that the recipient's bank can immediately credit the recipient with the funds. So a second necessary element of a faster payment involves clearing with 24/7 real-time communication between the banks about the underlying payment that their customers are conducting. But when we think about settlement, there are two broad models of settlement for how these sorts of 24/7 real-time payments could be conducted. The first would be to let the end-user and interbank communication happen quickly and at any time. So banks can credit and debit their customers' accounts to complete the payment, but then to put off settlement until some later point in time. So payments could take place, end users receiving funds in real time, banks communicating the information about those payments, but those payments could then be accumulated, possibly netted, and then settled at some later point in time. And this type of arrangement, which involves what we can call deferred settlement, could be attractive for a number of reasons. So it focuses on allowing payments to take place and simply worry about settling up between the banks later on. And it could be done using existing settlement arrangements. So faster payments could, in a sense, be retrofitted on top of things that already exist for settlement. But one key implication of this sort of deferred settlement for faster payments is that it inherently involves credit risk between the banks to a payment. So faster payments, as I talked about earlier, envision providing funds to recipients in real time and at any time to match the 24/7 real-time experience that end users have with other activities. But if settlement is deferred, so if it takes place later after the payments have been completed for end users, then the recipient's bank is exposed to the risk that it will have provided the funds to its customer, but it might not receive those funds from its counterparty bank. So there can be ways to mitigate this risk associated with essentially the decoupling of what's happening with the payment from the settlement. So, for example, there could be caps placed on exposures. There could be collateral that's used against those caps. But those measures can be complicated to implement and maintain, and it nevertheless remains the case that deferred settlement for faster payments inherently involves risks that need to be measured or to be managed. So moving on to the 10th slide in the presentation, the alternative to this type of deferred settlement for faster payments involves what's known as real-time gross settlement. So each individual payment could be settled on a payment-by-payment basis before at the same time that end users are conducting payments. So in other words, just as end users are conducting payments in real time and at any time, so too could the individual payments that are taking place be settled between the end users' banks in real time and at any time. So this sort of arrangement would align the speed of interbank settlement with the speed of the underlying payment between end users, and interbank settlement would exactly line up with the conduct of the payment for end users. This sort of arrangement, this sort of real-time gross settlement arrangement for faster payments can have a number of implications. First, by aligning interbank settlement with end-user payments, there's inherently no interbank credit risk in this sort of arrangement. So unlike in a deferred settlement arrangement where a recipient's bank might provide funds before receiving funds from its counterparty bank, with real-time gross settlement, the recipient's bank only provides funds for a payment when it's actually received those funds from its counterparty. And this takes place immediately and at any time to support the 24/7 real-time payment capabilities for end users. Second, real-time gross settlement also means that there are certain clearing functions that could be simplified. So, for example, there's no need to collect and potentially net payments so that they can then be settled because each individual payment is settled one by one. And there's no need to maintain risk mitigation measures to deal with deferred settlement. And even more broadly, the communication that's necessary for interbank settlement can be linked to the communication to conduct the payment, which can thereby sort of streamline the entire process of the payment. Interestingly, when we look around the world, not only are efforts to develop these sorts of faster payments a worldwide phenomenon, but increasingly a wide range of countries have started to implement real-time gross settlement services as the way to actually settle the faster payments for the systems that they're implementing. So one of the key propositions in the Federal Register notice is that as one thinks about the future of the payment system and thinks about 24/7 real-time payment services being provided to end users, a key proposition is then that real-time gross settlement is the appropriate strategic foundation for the payment system moving forward. And this view reflects the safety, so the lack of credit risk, and the efficiency, the potential simplification of the conduct of payments that real-time gross settlement would provide. So one of the key questions in the Federal Register notice is asking for views on this proposition. So as we think about moving to a 24/7 real-time world for end-user payments, should the settlement infrastructure underlying those payments also be 24/7 and real-time? So moving to the 11th slide of the presentation, what the Federal Register notice then presents are potential actions that the Federal Reserve could take to support ubiquitous, safe, and efficient faster payments, so 24/7 real-time payments for end users through an infrastructure for 24/7 real-time interbank settlement. And these actions, again, are first the development of a Federal Reserve service that would provide 24/7 real-time gross settlement of faster payments, and second, the development of a liquidity management tool to address some of the issues that can arise related to liquidity management when settlement is occurring in real time and on a 24/7 basis. So I'm now going to turn to talk about these potential actions in more detail, but I see that there are a large number of questions that are starting to pop up, and I'm going to pause to see if we want to go through some of them about the things I just talked about in terms of the components of a payment, how settlement fits in, the possible models, and specifically real-time gross settlement as a model for settlement of faster payments.
Yes, this is Jackie again, and there are several questions, so thank you all for submitting them. First of all, with regard to the settlement discussion that presentation that you just gave us, Mark, first question, will this go along the ACH rails or a separate rail?
So I think given that the ACH rails are generally with deferring, this would likely involve a separate rail more akin to the Fedwire funds rail. I think there are questions about whether or not some of the existing connections can be leveraged to allow for the possible communication that would be necessary. But generally, this is something that's different than an ACH and is in some sense more akin to 24/7, 365 Fedwire.
Okay. Another question. Does the Fed have plans to make sending real-time payments mandatory, or will it follow same-day ACH rules where only the RDFI is mandated to receive payments? Also, will there be fees assessed to the FIs from the Fed?
So I think that the notion of something being mandatory at this stage is it's far too premature to envision that sort of thing. It's unclear that the Fed would have the authority to mandate any sort of participation. I think there are interesting questions that are raised in the Federal Register notice and that would be useful to hear feedback about what types of participation arrangements would be desirable. So would a receipt-only participation be an attractive possibility? What other types of variations in terms of variance in terms of participation would be attractive? I think it's also too premature to talk about the fees that might be assessed as part of this sort of service.
Okay, and another question, has distributed ledger been considered to solve these problems/challenges?
So I think distributed ledger technology is clearly something that's interesting and that the Federal Reserve is investigating and looking at in a variety of different settings. I think that at this stage, that technology and its scalability is still in question, and so I think this would be something that would be more akin to existing services that the Federal Reserve uses that aren't based on that sort of technology.
Could you please point to an example of how the Fed has engaged with the financial industry to improve payment security, as was previously mentioned?
So there was something, I spoke about the Faster Payments Task Force, which was a task force that was really focused on improvements related to the speed and convenience and efficiency of payments. There was also something that was known as the Secure Payments Task Force, and this was an industry effort, a task force that was stood up to look at improvements, issues with security of payments broadly, and potential improvements that could be made to the security of payments. And I think as the website that was referenced at the beginning of the presentation, fedpaymentimprovements.com, has additional information about the Secure Payments Task Force and some of their efforts.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. It's fedpaymentsimprovement.org if you do want to check that out. What issues/challenges does the Fed feel it is solving for with faster payments?
So I think the types of things that I was speaking about earlier in terms of the disconnect that occurs when engaging in different types of behavior or different types of activities today, and the 24/7 real-time experience in those activities, and the fact that payments often are clunky and don't work as smoothly as those other activities. And one could say, well, why does that really matter? What is really the problem that's being addressed there? But there could be frictions that are introduced. So one could think, for example, about individuals who have liquidity issues themselves, and the timing at which different payments are made and received is extremely important for those individuals as they manage their personal finances. So trying to remove those sorts of frictions that arise in the payment system simply because we're using more antiquated or older processes would be one possible problem that would be solved by moving to faster payments. And I think one of the other things about faster payments is that as one starts to modernize and expand the capabilities of the payment system, this can introduce the possibility of additional advances that leverage that sort of improvement. So one could think, for example, about including additional invoice or payment information along with the payment to be delivered to help straight-through processing that would be built on top of this sort of payment functionality. So the problem is really, I think, the fact that the payments industry hasn't particularly kept up with other aspects. There are concrete implications of that, such as for households or businesses that have liquidity issues. But I think this also is taking the payment system more into the 21st century to match what's going on in other aspects of life.
All right. And another question. Given that credit push payments will require one or more directories, what actions does the Fed anticipate to minimize the risk of errors or delays in loading and maintaining all of these directories? And who would assume the liabilities for the losses associated with these errors or delays?
So the issue of directories is a very interesting one, and the Federal Register notice asks questions about this particular issue, about the need for directories and who would be positioned to provide those directories and what form they should take. I think it's too early to answer the specific questions. I think that hearing industry feedback about the structure and some of the issues that could arise with directories is something that the Federal Register notice is looking to receive input on, because at the end of the day, you want the service to not only be fast, but you want it to be convenient for end users, and a directory that allows payment information to be linked to an alias is an important part of that convenience factor. At the same time, you don't want to have lots of errors popping up in a system because of mislinked aliases or these sorts of problems. So I think establishing the appropriate way to structure these directories and who should be responsible for them, and then how to deal with the potential problems that can arise, particularly if directories are linked, I think that's something that's extremely important to receive input about.
All right, another question. Lots of questions here. Would a clearing/settlement service by the Federal Reserve be interoperable with private sector solutions such as RTP?
You know, this is fantastic because we're not actually going to have to cover the questions that are at the end of the presentation, because people are raising these questions about directories or interoperability now. So this, I think, is a very important question as well. I think that this would depend on the demand for interoperability, how important it would be, and ultimately how important it would be for interoperability would be to achieve ubiquity in the market. So I think there are other instances of payment systems where the Fed and the private sector interoperate. There are lessons that can be learned from that about the difficulty and the issues that can arise there. I think the important issue here is to try to achieve ubiquity associated with broad access and broad availability of these services to the public. If interoperability is a necessary element of that, I think that would be both an important thing to hear about from the private sector, but also something that would then need to be investigated to see how that interoperability might work and what steps might be taken to achieve it.
All right. Another question. Will Regulation E apply to these faster payments? In other words, will the sending customer be protected and the sending bank be required to pay the sender in cases of fraud?
So I think these are the types of questions that are going to depend on the specific details of the rule set and the legal framework around the payments. Much of what I'm talking about today is about an infrastructure that could underlie these sorts of payments, and the application of things like Regulation E. I think that's still, unfortunately, TBD. I do think, however, that consumer protection is a really important aspect here, where things are happening in real time from the end user perspective. I spoke about the benefits to end users of these sorts of faster payments, but at the same time, it means that errors also happen in real time. And if the error happens and the recipient receives those funds and then goes off and spends them, it can be difficult to recover those funds. So I think that determining appropriate ways to deal with those sorts of error resolutions, determining the sorts of protections that would apply, are going to be important aspects of making sure, again, that from an end user's perspective, this is a fully desirable service to be involved in. I think the underlying infrastructure associated with settlements looks to broadly provide a platform that the industry could use. And then the application of regulations, different types of rules, I think would be determined based on what that infrastructure looks like and what the payments being conducted through it ultimately involve.
Okay. And how long does the Fed expect it to take to be ready to support a 24/7 by 365 RTGS settlement service if this moves forward?
So again, it's a question that's a little bit premature because the Federal Reserve hasn't even decided whether or not it's going to move forward with this service. I think in the next year that determination will be made, and then there'll be a determination of what sorts of time frames we would be looking at. And this is going to depend on some of the design features. So, for example, as I'll talk about when talking about the 24/7, 365 real-time gross settlement service, what account structure would be used, and that can have implications for the complexity of structuring the service and standing it up, which could then have implications for the time to market. I think time to market is a key question that the Federal Register notice asks about, trying to get industry views about what time would be ideal and what time would be too late. I mean, clearly ideal would be today if it were available today, but that's not really realistic. So how important is the time to market and the time at which this would be available to make this a viable and attractive service from an end user or from a depository institution perspective?
And there are lots of questions here, and just so folks know, if we're not able to get to all the questions that we're receiving, we will be responding to you with answers separate from this webinar today. But we'll take another couple on this particular break, and then we have two more occasions where we'll be soliciting questions as well. If the Federal Reserve processes the payment message for every real-time payment, the government will be collecting a tremendous amount of data on individuals. What measures is the Fed undertaking to ensure that personal privacy will be maintained under RTGS?
So I think this is also an important question that would be useful to hear input about, because as I was speaking about it, the fact that this information could be carried through as part of the settlement process is an advantage because it streamlines some of the communication and some of the processing that would need to take place to conduct a payment. But as this question is noting, that also implies that there's information that's being carried through that individuals might not necessarily know is being carried through. I think the Federal Reserve takes this sort of privacy and security very seriously. And so this would be something that would have to be assessed in terms of the resiliency of that data and the fact that that data would not be used for purposes that it's not intended to be used for.
All right, we'll take one more question in this section, and then we'll move on. And thank you, everyone, for all these great questions. Given that any Fed solution will support banks only, how would this development enable an infrastructure to service the unbanked and underbanked, or is this outside the scope?
So I think that the service could help with the unbanked or underbanked to the degree that there are service providers who may provide different types of services to those groups who look to leverage this infrastructure through their banks or as agents through banks to access the service. Whether those types of participation arrangements would be possible is something that I think it would be important to hear about. I think it doesn't directly address the issue of the unbanked and the underbanked because by necessity, the Fed solution, as the question states, involves working through the banking industry. But to the degree that this sort of infrastructure would allow banks to provide better services to, say, non-banks who are then providing services to the unbanked or the underbanked, it could provide additional improvements to the services that those parties experience.
Okay, so now I think we'll continue on with the presentation. At this point, we're going to go into more depth on the 24/7 365 RTGS service.
Okay, so thanks, Jackie. So turning to the 12th slide of the presentation, and thank you again for all the questions. I'm now going to talk about the first potential action that's presented in the Federal Register notice, so the potential provision of a service for 24 by 7 by 365 real-time gross settlement of faster payments. And fundamentally, what this service would do is it would involve upgraded and modernized Federal Reserve settlement services that depository institutions could then use to provide upgraded and modernized services to their end user customers. So the way you could think about the service, as I've been referring to it, is as an infrastructure, so focused on the settlement part of a payment and based on real-time gross settlement. And this infrastructure could serve as a platform or a foundation on which the private sector could develop improved payment services for end users. So turning to slide 13, and I recognize that a lot of the questions have already sort of anticipated this caveat. I want to stress by saying that the potential service as outlined in the Federal Register notice doesn't specify every detail of the service. So there are various features that would need to be determined. And one of the purposes of the Federal Register notice is really to ask industry participants about those different design features and how those design features would matter and why they would matter to industry participants and to the public. But there are some key elements that would be inherent to any real-time gross settlement service. The first is that it would be a real-time gross settlement service. That is, it would involve payment by payment, interbank settlement, to line up the interbank settlement of a payment with the real-time speed of underlying payments for end users. So this would involve real-time messaging of settlement instructions to the service, and then from the service to the banks to enable real-time settlement of payments. Second, because the service would be provided through the Federal Reserve, settlement would occur through adjustments to balances and accounts of the Federal Reserve banks. So debits would be made to the accounts of sending banks, credits would be made to the accounts of receiving banks, and this would all happen in real time to perform settlement of individual payments between those banks. However, even given that the settlement would occur in accounts at the Federal Reserve banks, there are variants in terms of how those accounts might be structured, and I alluded to this a little bit in my earlier comments. So one possibility would be for the payments to settle directly on the master accounts of depository institutions. Another possibility would be for the service to operate on balances in sub-accounts that would be held under master accounts. And a further possibility would be for the service to conduct settlement using completely separate accounts from the master accounts of depository institutions. And so the Federal Register notice asks about these different account structures for such a service and how those account structures might matter for banks that could potentially use this sort of service. So in addition to being a real-time service that makes adjustments to balances held at the reserve banks, the service would operate 24/7, 365. So it would be available to conduct settlement at any time, on any day, including holidays, weekends, and it would do that to support the provision of real-time payments to end users at any time and on any day. Because the service would operate, or settlement would occur through the service on a payment-by-payment basis, the service could combine messaging with settlement. And again, this is something that's come up in some of the questions that have been raised. So the two activities, messaging and settlement, would necessarily have to take place at the same time. And so the service could carry the entire payment message through from the sending bank to the receiving bank. This could simplify the communication between the banks necessary to complete a payment, and it could be similar in many respects, as I've said earlier, to the FedWire Funds service in terms of the information that's carried through the service and delivered to the recipient bank. So this, again, could simplify some of the communication between the banks and could leverage the payment-by-payment real-time settlement capabilities to enable real-time payment-by-payment communication about the payments between the banks as part of the service. Because the service would operate on accounts at the Federal Reserve banks, access to the service would be available to depository institutions, and it would be available to the institutions eligible to hold those accounts. But here again, there could be variants. So agents, for example, might be able to submit instructions on behalf of banks that participate in the service, as they're able to do for certain other Federal Reserve services. And there could still be processors or other intermediaries that provide connections between the banks and the service. More broadly, the communication between banks and the service could look to leverage existing connections that banks have with the Federal Reserve banks. And some of the key issues that are raised in the Federal Register notice concern the sort of participation arrangements that would be attractive for banks that are looking to use the service, as well as the connectivity that would be needed in order for them to actually take advantage of it and use it. And finally, there could be technical issues that may need to be addressed. So, for example, maintenance of 7-day accounting to reflect the continuous activity that could occur through the service. So such a change to accounting, to a 7-day accounting regime, could be necessary for purposes of things like reserve calculations. And the Federal Register notice, again, asks a variety of questions about how these sorts of changes to deal with a 24/7 real-time settlement environment would affect the depository institutions that might use this sort of service. So turning to the 14th slide of the presentation, this slide illustrates how such a service might work from sort of a conceptual perspective, building on the concepts that I talked about earlier in terms of the elements of a payment. So here the end user service is grayed out because the potential service I'm talking about doesn't really directly address that level, and instead focuses on the infrastructure for the provision of payments by banks. And as the diagram illustrates, each individual payment would pass through the settlement service, reflecting the real-time payment-by-payment settlement inherent in that arrangement. This could simplify some of the communication between the banks, so you could still have various processors or other intermediaries involved in a payment, but the communication could be simplified and streamlined to reflect that the communication necessary as part of settlement could also be incorporated as part of the communication needed to actually perform the payment. And again, in this respect, the service could function very similar to the Fedwire Fund service in terms of the message exchange that it enables and supports between the banks. And then reflecting the fact that the settlement service would be taking place at the Federal Reserve banks, payment-by-payment real-time settlement would occur through adjustments to the balances of banks at the reserve banks, that is, with debits to the accounts of sending banks and credits to the account of the receiving banks. And this would happen at the time that each individual payment is taking place, 24 hours a day. So that is an overview of the 24/7 real-time gross settlement service that's presented in the Federal Register notice. And before turning to the liquidity management tool, I again want to pause and see if we've received any questions about this potential service.
Hi, Mark. Yes, we've continued to receive questions. What makes RTGS service for faster payments different from a wire payment? Why not just increase the hours of Fedwire to 24/7/365?
So I think that in some sense that is what is being envisioned here, but with one important caveat, which is that the wires are not inherently focused on the end user experience. So the Fedwire really serves as a mechanism for transfers between banks, but the end user is not really as involved, or at least the end user's outcome isn't as specified as part of the service. Now, I don't want to say that the end user experience would be specified directly as part of this 24/7, 365 real-time gross settlement service, but it's important to recognize that what this is looking to achieve is an end user experience that is 24/7, 365, and real time. So in a sense, a wire transfer is somewhat removed from the end user experience. This would be more directly integrated as an attempt to support that end user experience. Now, whether or not Fedwire could simply be expanded to 24/7, 365, this gets again into a design element associated with, say, throughput or other sorts of issues that may come up. But at least conceptually, there's a sense in which there is a very close analogy between what's being proposed here and what would look like with sort of 24/7, 365 Fedwire, outside of the focus on the end user experience as the real objective.
Okay. Another question, can you explain how settlement would occur if a FI does not have an account with the Federal Reserve and goes through a correspondent?
So I think that there it's going to depend on the types of participation arrangements that the service allows. As I said, these sorts of participation arrangements are something that the Federal Register notice asks about, to see about, say, corporate credit unions, bankers, banks, other sorts of correspondent banking relationships, and how those would fit into the service. I think it's possible that the service could allow settlement to occur through the correspondent, but I think that would be something that would need to be determined, and it would be important to hear about the importance of those sorts of arrangements from, say, a smaller depository institution's perspective. At least in the way that I presented it, it's envisioning directly settling on the accounts of the entities holding the balances at the Federal Reserve banks. So that would have to be adjusted somewhat to deal with this sort of more indirect involvement.
Okay, another question. If adoption of a service is not mandatory, wouldn't you still have the possibility of payment delay, as discussed at the beginning, if the receiving FI is not set up for this RTGS service?
So that certainly would be the case if the receiving FI was not set up to receive the service. I think there would be two issues that could arise. One is if the receiving FI is not set up for the service at all, and there I think that you would have a problem, not of payment delay, but more a problem of ubiquity and reach. Would the customers of that FI actually be able to receive and potentially send these sorts of payments? The second would be if there were, so that's one possibility. I think that's slightly different from what the question is asking about, but I think it's an important issue to keep in mind because really an objective here is to make this broadly accessible and ubiquitous. And so you could admittedly still have problems if the receiving FI is not set up for that service. The second would be if, the receiving FI for some reason signed up for the service but didn't want to adhere to all of the availability rules. I think this is similar in a sense to the kind of receipt-only possibility. Would there be demand for a service where some instances an institution only wants to receive these payments and make them available but not actually allow their customers to send them at any time? Now, whether or not, in addition, a receiving FI might want to say, I want to sign up for the service, but I only want to make availability at some later point in time, say after I reopen at the end of the weekend. I think that, again, would be something that would be interesting to hear about. I don't think that's entirely consistent with what the overall effort to provide these payments is looking to achieve. But at the same time, if that turns out to be something that's necessary for, say, smaller depository institutions to try to at least initially deal with these sorts of payment capabilities, that would be something that would be useful to hear about.
All right. Will faster payments support international remittance transfers governed under Dodd-Frank regulations? If so, does the Fed foresee any issues and requirements for banks to invest in their infrastructure to support remittance transfer receipts for consumers?
So I think at this point, what this is envisioned being used for is domestic purposes. So sort of get our own house in order, try to get our own capabilities internally in the United States sort of upgraded and moved forward, and not worry as much about or focus as much on the sort of cross-border elements. But that having been said, I think issues associated with cross-border payments, whether the sort of remittance issues that were discussed in the question or more broader cross-border payments, is certainly an issue of interest to many in the industry. I think that would be further down the road for this sort of system, but who knows what the future may bring, I suppose, in some sense. But I would say this is not currently the focus of these efforts.
All right. Another question. Who will pay for these potential actions? If the Fed has to build the RTGS service to run 24/7 by 365 and banks have to run around-the-clock accounting, won't this drive up prices for banking services generally?
So I think that, as I said, the Federal Reserve has to recover costs. And so there needs to be a mechanism for the Federal Reserve to recover costs associated with the services that it provides. And it generally does that through fees. And so I think although I can't speculate about what those fees might be, the investment and the operating costs would, as with any enhancement to services, would likely involve costs and fees. Now, whether or not banks have to drive up prices for their banking services, I think this partly depends on the value proposition that different end users have with respect to these sorts of payments and the degree to which they're able or willing to pay for them and what other sorts of value-added types of services can be leveraged on top of them. I think one of the things about this sort of improvement is that if one takes a very sort of narrow business case perspective, I think increasingly that business case perspective has sort of turned more towards the provision of these sorts of faster payments. So when I've talked to industry participants at some of the other town halls, they would say, 5-10 years ago, it wasn't clear that there was a business case for this. Now it's increasingly becoming the case that there is, and who knows what the future may bring in terms of the capabilities. So even if in sort of a narrow business case perspective, some of these improvements might not appear immediately obvious, I think there's a longer-term strategic perspective that suggests that needing to maintain relationships with account holders, needing to maintain or to be close to the payment experience of those customers, that's an important investment from the perspective of depository institutions, because one of the individuals at that town hall who was telling me about all the great use cases, he was a fintech operator who was basically talking about how great he was looking to make all of these payment experiences for his clients. So I think there can be challenges associated with costs. I think that figuring out the appropriate pricing model is going to be important. But I do think that in the longer run, this is going to be an important investment for the future of the payment industry in the United States.
Okay, we'll take one more question, and then we'll move on to the next portion of the presentation. The service would be available 24/7, but would I, as a bank, have to be available on the service all the time?
So that's a good question. This gets back again to the sort of variance in terms of participation and availability that I was speaking about in terms of receipt only versus send and receipt. Whether or not being available or to make the funds available 24/7 would be something. I think that the vision here would be that, yes, this capability would be available and would be provided through the banks to the end user customers 24/7, 365. The Federal Register notice asks about the challenges of real time, the challenges of 24/7, and the challenges of 365. What does it mean to go to 365-day-a-year operation? There are other operations that already exist for banks, so things like ATM withdrawals, debit card operations, that do happen in some sense in real time, at least in terms of some of the activities, and are taking place 365 days a year. So the degree to which smaller institutions are able to leverage some of their existing relationships, say with their processors or with their other providers of services, to avail themselves to the 24/7, 365 capabilities of this service, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But hearing about how big those challenges would be, particularly for smaller depository institutions, is something that the Federal Register notice asks questions about to understand how those challenges arise and how they differ from some of the other activities, or how they would arise for this sort of service and how they differ from some of the other activities like debit cards or ATM withdrawals that banks already provide to their customers 24 hours a day.
All right, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for submitting these great questions. We're going to move on now to the portion of the presentation that has to do with the liquidity management tool. So if you all could turn to slide 15 here.
Great. So I guess this will probably be the last part of the presentation because I probably won't have much time to get to the questions in the Federal Register notice. But the liquidity management tool is intended to address an issue that can arise associated with liquidity in an environment with 24/7, 365 real-time settlement. And the issue is that to the extent that liquidity or funds are used for settlement of faster payments, that liquidity is separate from other liquidity, it might be necessary to reallocate those funds, so for a bank to reallocate its liquidity to support the real-time settlement of faster payments. And moreover, it might be necessary to do this reallocation or rebalancing outside of normal business hours. So without the ability to move liquidity, a bank could find that its liquidity for settlement of faster payments would be depleted because of outgoing activity. And because in real-time gross settlement, each individual payment requires liquidity for settlement, the bank could find that its customers' payments are being rejected due to insufficient liquidity available for settlement, even if the customers have adequate balances with the bank and the bank has liquidity available elsewhere. And this could happen particularly at night or over the weekend when other tools to move around and reallocate liquidity are not available, and no one would want this outcome. So rejected payments due to insufficient liquidity is something that the bank wouldn't want. Its customers wouldn't understand, and it wouldn't want. Then they wouldn't want that to happen, their payments to be rejected. So simply because there's a liquidity mismatch in terms of where liquidity is allocated is not a reason or is not a desirable thing to have happen for these types of payments with real-time settlement. So the liquidity management tool would allow banks to avoid this outcome by providing them with a method to reallocate liquidity from places where it's not currently needed to accounts needed where liquidity is needed to support real-time settlement of faster payments. And there are at least two scenarios in which this could arise. One would be the scenario I talked about earlier where a Federal Reserve Service were using separate accounts for settlement as opposed to using the master account. And in that situation, it might be necessary to move liquidity outside of normal business hours from the master account to the settlement account for the faster payment real-time gross settlement service. A second scenario would be if there were a private sector entity that were maintaining a joint account at a Federal Reserve Bank, and we're using that joint account to hold funds on behalf of participants in that private sector arrangement. So if a private sector entity had this sort of joint account, it could conduct real-time settlement by maintaining a ledger of balances against the joint account, using that account to back its ledger and make adjustments to the balances that it attributes to participants based on their payments activity. And in this sort of situation, a bank could find that its balance in the joint account, according to the private sector entity's ledger, would get depleted again outside of normal business hours. And so, again, there may be a need to transfer additional liquidity to the joint account from the bank's other sources of liquidity to ensure that there would not be rejected payments because of insufficient liquidity in the joint account. So in both of these situations, separate accounts with a Federal Reserve Service or a joint account for a private sector settlement arrangement, the problem that arises is that there can be possible segmentation of liquidity and a need to reallocate that liquidity outside of normal business hours to avoid rejected payments. So with that background and that motivation for the issue that this tool is looking to deal with, turning to slide 16 in the presentation, the liquidity management tool would exactly provide this sort of mechanism to reallocate liquidity by allowing a bank to transfer funds from its master account to another account that's being used to conduct real-time gross settlement of faster payments. So again, on slide 16 in the presentation, because these liquidity needs can arise at any time, this can require reallocation of liquidity at any time. So the tool would be available to conduct these transfers outside of standard business hours. So this could be used as a way to reallocate liquidity among accounts used for a Federal Reserve settlement service, or to reallocate liquidity to a joint account used to back a private sector real-time settlement arrangement. And again, there are a number of possible variants that could arise here, and the Federal Register notice asks questions about these variants. So one variant is whether or not this liquidity management service would need to be available 24 hours a day. So would it be necessary 24 hours a day to reflect the potential 24-hour need for reallocation of liquidity, or might there just be windows over the weekends or on holidays when liquidity reallocation could occur? Second, how should the liquidity transfer be initiated? Should they be transfers that individual banks would initiate between their own accounts, so they'd be bank initiated, or should it be possible for an agent to initiate transfers on behalf of banks so that banks could outsource some of the liquidity management tasks when a bank might not be fully online? And should banks be able to establish standing instructions or automatic transfers such that the liquidity transfers would occur when certain thresholds are reached? And these latter two possibilities reflect possible ways to alleviate some of the burden of liquidity management for banks that may not want to be tasked with managing liquidity on a 24/7, 365 basis, and ultimately to alleviate some of the burden on them of participating in 24/7, 365 real-time settlement of payments. So slide 17 illustrates this liquidity management tool, again, using the concepts that I laid out earlier. And here, all three levels of a payment are grayed out because the liquidity management tool isn't directly involved in the conduct of any individual payment. Instead, what the tool looks to do is to support the provision of liquidity that would enable the conduct of payments more generally. So in addition, what the diagram here depicts is the movement of liquidity between banks' master accounts at the reserve banks and a joint account, such as a joint account that might be used by a private sector settlement arrangement that uses that account to back its ledger for settling payment activity between its participant banks. And what the tool would allow is funds to be moved from master accounts to the joint account, and importantly, would allow this movement to occur outside of standard business hours so that banks that had insufficient balances in the joint account could replenish their balances in that account and allow payments to continue to take place. So this liquidity management tool is looking to allow for this sort of reallocation of liquidity outside of the hours that normal reallocations could take place in order to allow for payments to continue to take place as necessary in a real-time gross settlement arrangement. So at this point, we're running out of time quickly, but I want to pause and see if we've received any questions about this particular tool.
Yes, we have received some some questions. Mark, could a sender request their credit back if needed?
So this doesn't directly address the liquidity management tool, but this is more a question about the underlying payment functionality. And I think that's one way to try to deal with these sorts of errors, to have sort of a in-system process for requesting funds back. I think this is something that would need to be worked out, but it's a particularly attractive way. The difficulty that arises here is that even if the sender requests the money back, the erroneous or nefarious recipient may not be interested in sending the money back. So whether or not there can be a sort of a chargeback or a request for the credit to be reversed, I think these are important things, again, because these sorts of consumer protection issues are really vital to making this an attractive and appealing service to end users.
All right. Is the settlement tool an expedited way for FIs to borrow short-term money from the Fed?
Is the settlement tool, not the settlement tool. The liquidity management tool is not, so if we're thinking about the liquidity management tool, it is, so neither of these are intended in the way that they're structured to borrow short-term money from the Fed. The liquidity management tool is intended to allow funds that already exist to be reallocated, and the settlement tool is intended to allow for those funds to be transferred between banks very quickly. Now, whether or not there might be additional, say, daylight credit or overnight lending that could occur as part of these services, I think that is an important issue to investigate that the Fed would need to consider, because in that case, it's not simply a liquidity allocation issue, which the liquidity management tool would try to deal with, but it would be more just an overall shortage of liquidity, perhaps temporary, that could potentially be dealt with through borrowing from the Fed. These existing services don't inherently involve that, but that would, again, be something that would be potentially considered and would be useful to hear about in terms of its usefulness.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for all the great questions. We are running short on time. I did want to convey a few pieces of information here. For those of you who still have questions that you'd like to submit, you can do so by addressing your questions on email to fedpaymentsimprovement@chi.frb.org. That's chi.frb.org. And then also, just so you're aware, many people had this question, a recording of this webinar will be available at our website, fedpaymentsimprovement.org, starting Wednesday. And just when you get to that website, you'll see up top there's a navigation with several options to go to. You'll want to hit on the Faster Payments navigation button. You'll see a drop-down menu there. There's a selection for settlement assessment. That is where you can find a lot of additional information, including information on how to submit formal comments to the board. And again, those comments are due December 14th. So again, just wanted to thank you so much for joining today, and have a nice afternoon.